108 Australian and New Zealand soldiers walked into a rubber plantation. 2,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars were waiting for them. And you know what happened next? A monsoon broke overhead so violent it turned the red earth into liquid, washed the map ink off the paper a New Zealand artillery captain was trying to read, and reduced visibility to 50 meters. The Australians were surrounded. The Americans couldn't get jets through the cloud cover. The helicopters almost didn't come. And the only thing standing between D Company, 6 RAR, and complete annihilation was a 34-year-old Kiwi captain lying in the mud with a radio handset pressed against his ear, calling down artillery shells so close to his own position that the shrapnel was cutting the rubber trees above his head in half. Wait, a New Zealander? From a battery of 6 guns and about 120 men? Those New Zealand gunners were the ones who fired the rounds that broke the Vietnamese assault waves. Oh, this story gets so much wilder than you think, because what those Kiwi gunners did at Long Tan on the afternoon of the 18th of August 1966, the volume of fire they sustained, the accuracy they achieved in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible, and the refusal of a single forward observer to quit when every instinct in his body was screaming that the next round would kill his own mates, wasn't just impressive. It was the difference between a victory that still gets commemorated every year across 2 nations and a massacre that would have rewritten the history of Anzac involvement in Vietnam. One Australian veteran, speaking decades later, reduced it to a single sentence: "Send the Kiwi guns they never missed." You're about to discover why the smallest artillery unit in the 1st Australian Task Force, fewer than 200 men total across its entire rotation cycle, ended up firing more than 3,000 rounds in 3.5 hours to save a company of Australian infantry that American firepower simply could not reach. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why the Vietnamese commanders who survived that afternoon wrote detailed intelligence assessments warning their forces about a specific type of Allied artillery, the kind that came from Nui Dat, the kind that fell with impossible precision through weather the Americans had already written off as unflyable. Stay with me. To understand why a New Zealand field battery ended up holding the line for Australian infantry in Phuoc Tuy Province, you have to go back to May of 1965. The American decision to commit the 173rd Airborne Brigade to combat operations in South Vietnam had just landed on the desks of every ally within the ANZU's framework. Washington wanted partners. Australia moved first, committing an infantry battalion. The New Zealand government under Prime Minister Keith Holyoake moved second, but moved carefully. Sending combat forces to Vietnam meant breaking with a century of tradition where New Zealand had always fought alongside Britain. The British weren't coming this time. The fight would be with the Americans and the Australians. Australia committed infantry, the traditional blooded arm that had defined its military identity since Gallipoli. New Zealand committed artillery. Specifically, 110 men of 161 Field Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery under the command of Major Harry Honner, 9 officers, 101 other ranks, and 4 105mm five-pack howitzers, later increased to 6 guns. They arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base on the 16th of July, 1965, the first New Zealand combat unit in Vietnam, and they were immediately attached as the 3rd Battery of the United States Army's 3rd Battalion, 319th Field Artillery Regiment, operating under the 173rd Airborne Brigade. On paper, it looked like a minor contribution. In practice, what the New Zealanders brought with them was a particular philosophy of gunnery, traced through the jungles of Malaya, the hills of Korea, and ultimately back to the long, continuous artillery tradition inherited from the British Royal Artillery. The New Zealand gunner was selected and trained to be fast, accurate, and unflappable. The battery drilled relentlessly on one principle above all others. When the infantry call, you fire. When they correct, you adjust. When they say danger close, you keep firing anyway, because the alternative is watching men die over a radio you can't answer. The first shots fired in anger came on the 16th of July, 1965, when the battery opened up on a Viet Cong position in War Zone D in support of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The infantry they were supporting were Australians. The command structure was American. The accents on the gun line were Kiwi. That triangular arrangement, New Zealand guns firing for Australian infantry under American operational control, would define the shape of the war for 161 Battery for the next 6 years, 10 months, and 21 days, the longest continuous deployment of any Allied combat unit in Vietnam after the 173rd Airborne itself. Sergeant Alistair John Sherwood Don and Bombardier Robert White became the first Kiwi casualties of the war almost immediately, hit when a Viet Cong command-detonated mine blew up the front of their vehicle during an early road convoy. It was a brutal introduction to counterinsurgency in a country where the enemy could be anywhere. But 161 Battery did not flinch. In May of 1966, the strategic picture changed. The Australian government decided to create its own independent task force rather than continue having Australian battalions scattered through American units. Phuoc Tuy Province was chosen as the tactical area of responsibility, and the base at Nui Dat was built to house it. The New Zealand government was given a choice: keep 161 Battery at Bien Hoa under American operational control, or move it to Nui Dat to support the new 1st Australian Task Force. Wellington chose the Australians. By June of 1966, the New Zealand gunners had relocated to Nui Dat, taken up position alongside the Australian 103 and 105 field batteries of the 1st Field Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery, and begun operating as an integral part of the Task Force Artillery Group. This decision would, 2 months later, prove to be one of the most consequential choices in the history of the New Zealand military. On the morning of the 18th of August, 1966, the Australian base at Nui Dat was recovering from a night that had nearly turned into a disaster. In the early hours of the 17th, a Viet Cong force operating from a position just 2 kilometers east of the perimeter had opened fire with mortars and recoilless rifles, raking the Australian base for 22 minutes before counter-battery fire drove them off. 24 Australians were wounded. An enemy force had been close enough to range the base with medium weapons, which meant something larger was moving in the area. Signals intelligence had already detected the Viet Cong 275th Regiment and the D445 Battalion moving toward Long Tan, but the Australians at Nui Dat did not know the full picture. The morning of the 18th brought a concert. The Australian entertainers Col Joy and Little Patty had been flown in to perform for the troops. Most of the task force was looking forward to a rare afternoon of music and beer. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, under the command of Major Harry Smith, was not. They had drawn the short straw, ordered out to relieve B Company, which had been searching the Long Tan rubber plantation area for the enemy mortar firing positions. Smith was not happy about missing the concert. Neither were his men. At around 11 in the morning, they began moving out. Attached to D Company was a 3-man forward observer party from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery. The officer in charge was Captain Maurice Stanley, universally known as Maury. 35 years old, born in Christchurch, raised in Napier, a graduate of the Royal Military College, Duntroon. A careful, quiet, deeply professional artilleryman who had arrived in Vietnam only months earlier after a last-minute telephone call to his Hamilton office telling him to get ready to go. With him were Bombardier Willie Walker, his radio operator, and Lance Bombardier Murray Broomhall. 3 New Zealanders moving into the rubber plantation with 105 Australians, making up a company of 108 men. Stanley's map case held the grid references for the Long Tan plantation. His radio was tuned to the fire control net back at Nui Dat. 6 kilometers behind them sat 18 105mm howitzers, 12 Australian, 6 Kiwi. Further back still sat 6 155mm self-propelled howitzers from the 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery Regiment of the United States Army, 24 guns in total. That was the entire weight of fire support available to D Company. If things went wrong, they went wrong fast. D Company entered the Long Tan rubber plantation at around 3 in the afternoon. The rubber trees stood in rows like columns in a cathedral, the canopy 40 feet above the ground, the understory mostly cleared, the visibility stretching perhaps 100 meters in any direction. The ground was soft from the approaching monsoon. The air was thick and humid. At about 15 minutes past 3, 11 Platoon, leading the advance under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, a 21-year-old national serviceman, made contact with a small Viet Cong patrol. A brief exchange of fire, 1 enemy wounded, the rest melting away into the trees. Smith ordered 11 Platoon to continue the pursuit. What happened next has been analyzed by military historians for 6 decades. 11 Platoon advanced roughly in line, moving deeper into the rubber, and at about 10 minutes past 4, they walked into the front edge of what was almost certainly the Viet Cong 275th Regiment, reinforced, waiting in a prepared ambush position. The first burst of automatic fire cut down 4 men of 11 Platoon in the opening seconds. The volume was staggering. Heavy machine guns, rifle fire, rocket-propelled grenades, all converging on the Australian position from multiple directions. Sharp immediately recognized his platoon was in serious trouble. He got on the radio to the forward observer and called for artillery. At 12 minutes past 4, at Nui Dat, Captain Maurice Stanley was repeating the grid coordinates, and the gun line of 161 Battery was already swinging. 6 105mm howitzers, recently upgraded from the older L5 pack howitzers to the heavier American M2A2 models, laid in on the target. The first rounds went downrange. The shells punched through the canopy of the rubber plantation and detonated among the advancing Viet Cong with the distinctive high explosive crack that veterans would say for the rest of their lives was the sound of friendly gunnery. Then the sky opened. The monsoon broke directly over the Long Tan plantation at precisely the worst possible moment. The rain came down in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to 50 meters. The rubber canopy funneled the water into streams that turned the red earth into a sucking mud. Radios began to fail. Map cases filled with water. The Viet Cong, knowing the weather would ground the American close air support, pressed their attack with renewed aggression. Waves of enemy infantry began assaulting 11 Platoon's position from the east, probing from the northwest and southeast, trying to envelop the isolated Australians before they could consolidate. This is the moment in the battle where, by any conventional calculation, D Company should have been destroyed. They were outnumbered somewhere between 15 and 25 to 1, depending on how the enemy's strength is counted. Their own air support was useless because the fighter bombers could not get below the cloud ceiling. The American 155mm battery was in range, but ranging heavy guns onto targets this close to friendly troops in driving rain was extraordinarily dangerous. The helicopters that would eventually bring ammunition had not yet been dispatched. The Australians were dying, and the Americans could not reach them. The Kiwi guns could. At 19 minutes past 4, Stanley put in a request that would define the rest of the battle. He called for the fire mission to be upgraded to a regimental fire mission, meaning all 24 guns, everything in range, all firing on his coordinates. The request was initially refused. Other units had priority calls. The Artillery Coordination Cell at Nui Date had to balance commitments across the entire task force area of operations. 5 RAR was operating to the north. The Australian 103 Battery was in direct support of them. Only 161 Battery was directly supporting D Company. 1 battery, 6 guns. At 20 minutes past 4, Major Harry Smith got on the radio himself and, in language that reportedly did not require any translation across any dialect of English, demanded that Stanley's request be granted. Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, commanding the task force, made the decision. Send the guns, all of them. The regimental fire mission was approved, and every tube at Nui Dat within range of Long Tan joined the fight. For the next 3.5 hours, what happened on the gun line at Nui Dat was something the New Zealand Army would later consider one of the most sustained artillery engagements ever fired by a Commonwealth battery in a single action. The guns of 161 Battery, alongside 103 and 105 Australian field batteries and the American 155s, began firing at 8 rounds per gun per minute. That was 2 rounds above the rate artillery manuals, defined as the intense rate, the theoretical maximum sustained rate of fire before the barrels began to suffer heat damage and the crews began to suffer physical collapse. The New Zealand crews fired at that pace, not for a fire mission of 2 or 3 minutes, but continuously for hours. Every available body on the battery, including clerks and drivers and cooks, was pressed into service to keep the guns fed. The breech blocks glowed, the paint on the barrels blistered, spent brass cases piled in mounds around each gun position, and men climbed over the mounds to keep loading. Maury Stanley was lying in the mud of the Long Tan plantation, his map folded in his hand, the rain and the running mud constantly obscuring the grid references he was trying to read. His rifle lay unattended next to him, ignored, because he could not afford to pick it up. Willie Walker, his radio operator, kept reminding him about the rifle. Stanley kept ignoring him, because the radio was his weapon now, and the weapon was working. Over the course of the battle he would call in more than 60 separate artillery fire missions and corrections. At one point, unable to see where his rounds were falling through the monsoon, hearing Australian voices on the radio screaming that enemy troops were within meters of their position, he lost his nerve for a single critical moment. He screamed into the handset, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" convinced he was about to kill his own mates. At the other end of the radio, a fellow New Zealander, Major Harry Honor, the battery commander, calmly talked him back. Honor's voice, steady and unhurried, walked Stanley back from the edge. The fire mission resumed. Stanley recalibrated and began again. He would later say, in the plain way that New Zealand gunners tend to describe extraordinary events, "I had to overcome my dread that I would make a mistake." The third man of the forward observer party, Murray Broomhall, was pulled away from his artillery duties partway through the battle to help defend the rear of D Company headquarters, where the enemy was probing close enough that every rifle mattered. Stanley and Walker were on their own at the radio for the rest of the action. The artillery fire that fell on the Viet Cong assault waves was, in the clinical language of the official after-action reports, decisive. In the language of the men who saw it, it was something closer to a meteorological event. The rubber plantation stood in perfectly geometric rows, the trees as evenly spaced columns, the ground between them offering no cover above the height of a kneeling man. When a 105 millimeter high explosive shell detonated among the rubber trees, the shrapnel pattern was shaped by those columns. It whipped down the rows in lethal channels, cutting through massed infantry like a scythe. The Viet Cong commanders, moving their men forward in waves to try to overwhelm the Australian perimeter by sheer weight of numbers, were putting those men into a killing ground where the geometry of the rubber plantation amplified every shell that landed. Stanley kept bringing the fire closer. At several points during the battle, he was calling rounds down to within 30 to 50 meters of the Australian positions. Military doctrine defined danger close as 100 meters. Stanley was calling fire at half that distance and less. When Sergeant Bob Buick took command of what was left of 11 Platoon after Gordon Sharp was killed trying to direct fire, Buick was down to 10 men out of 28, almost entirely surrounded, running low on ammunition, and convinced he was about to be overrun. Buick got on the radio and requested fire on his own position. He was prepared to die in exchange for taking the enemy assault wave with him. Stanley refused the request. He believed 11 Platoon might yet survive. He kept the fire landing where it could break the assault waves, not on top of the Australians. 13 of 11 Platoon's men would not come home that night. The next morning, when the Australians returned to the rubber plantation with armored personnel carriers and a bulldozer, they would find those 13 bodies still in their firing positions, still facing east toward the enemy, fingers still on their triggers, rain having washed them so clean that for a moment the recovery party thought they were still alive. But Stanley's refusal to call the fire on top of Buick's position meant that 2 of 11 Platoon, Barry Meller and Jim Richmond, survived. They were found the next morning, one of them leaning wounded against a rubber tree, waving. Back at Nui Dat, the gunners of 161 Battery were working in a rhythm that had stopped being conscious and had become something closer to muscle memory. Load, fire, eject, load, fire, eject. The barrels were so hot that the men working around them had to be rotated every few minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. The cordite smoke hung over the gun line in a cloud so thick that the gunners could taste it in their teeth for days afterward. They were firing at a volume the New Zealand artillery had not generated since Korea, because the voice on the other end of the fire control net was a New Zealand captain in the mud of a rubber plantation, and every round they sent downrange was the difference between their own countrymen living and dying. At around 6 in the evening, 2 RAAF UH-1B Iroquois helicopters appeared over the Long Tan plantation. Pilots, Frank Riley and Bob Grandin, in one aircraft, Cliff Dole and Bruce Lane in the other. They had been ordered by higher command to wait for better conditions. They had decided, quietly and professionally, to ignore those orders. They flew in at treetop height through the monsoon, under direct enemy fire, and dropped boxes of ammunition wrapped in blankets directly into the Australian position. The artillery had to stop firing during the resupply to let the helicopters in, and the pause nearly cost the battle because the Viet Cong immediately surged forward when the shell fire lifted. But the ammunition landed in the mud. The Australians tore the blankets open, the machine gunners reloaded, and when the artillery resumed, the Viet Cong were thrown back again. At around 7 in the evening, the relief force finally arrived. Australian Armoured Personnel Carriers of 3 Troop, 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron, under the command of Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, came smashing through the rubber with A Company, 6 RAR mounted on top. Their approach had been delayed repeatedly by hesitant orders from Task Force headquarters. When they finally entered the plantation, they broke up an enemy assault that was forming for what would have been a final attempt to overrun D Company before nightfall. Within minutes, the enemy force began to withdraw. By the time the battle ended, as suddenly, as Major Smith would later say, as if a tap had been turned off, the artillery batteries at Nui Dat had fired more than 3,000 rounds in support of D Company. Even the lower figure represents a volume of sustained fire that, in the Vietnam War, was rarely matched by any battery of any nationality for any single company-level engagement. 161 Battery alone had fired more than 180 shells in the first 2.5 hours before the full regimental mission even got going. In the final tally, Stanley and his forward observer party had coordinated the fires of 24 guns for 3.5 hours without a single friendly fire casualty attributable to artillery in any of the hundreds of individual fire missions. The Australian dead numbered 18. 24 were wounded. Enemy dead, counted on the battlefield the following morning, came to 245, with many more killed or wounded and carried away during the fighting. Artillery fire was credited in the post-battle analysis with inflicting the overwhelming majority of those enemy casualties. One assessment put the figure at approximately 90%. D Company had fought, and fought well, with their rifles and machine guns and grenades, but the reason they were alive at the end of the day was the wall of falling steel that came out of Nui Dat for 3.5 hours and did not stop until the enemy broke. And the voice that directed that wall of falling steel was a New Zealand captain with a soaked map folded in his hand. The aftermath of Long Tan belongs to the history of both Australia and New Zealand, but the artillery's specific role took longer to be fully acknowledged than it should have. For more than 4 decades, the Australian unit citation for gallantry was something only the surviving Australians of D Company had received. In May of 2010, that was corrected. Maury Stanley, by then 79 years old and recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, was invited to what he had been told was a family lunch in Auckland. What he walked into was a surprise ceremony attended by Harry Smith, Bob Buick, Dave Sabin, and his old radio operator, Willie Walker. The Australian and New Zealand governments had fast-tracked the award so that Stanley could receive the Australian unit citation for gallantry in person. Stanley passed away 4 months later, in September of 2010. At his funeral, both the Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard and the New Zealand Prime Minister John Key sent messages of tribute that were read aloud. A haka saw him out, but the story of 161 Battery does not end at Long Tan. Long Tan was only one of 17 major operations the battery would participate in during its 6 years and 10 months in Vietnam. And the other defining chapter of the New Zealand artillery contribution, the one that would eventually earn the battery its own separate Australian unit citation for gallantry in 2019, took place during the battles of Coral and Balmoral in May and June of 1968. By May of 1968, the Tet Offensive had reshaped the strategic picture across South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army was pressing against the approaches to Saigon in what would be called the Mini Tet. The Australian task force was ordered to deploy 120 kilometers north of Nui Dat to Bien Hoa province. The mission was to interdict North Vietnamese forces moving toward or withdrawing from Saigon. On the 12th of May, Fire Support Base Coral was established roughly 7 kilometers north of the town of Tan Nguyen. The helicopters delivering the guns and men to the site were watched from the surrounding tree line by North Vietnamese observers, and the enemy began planning an assault almost immediately. The initial deployment of Coral was chaotic. The New Zealand guns of 161 Battery were flown in by Chinook earlier than planned, arriving at the landing zone before the ground markers had been laid out and before the gun tractors were in position. Lieutenant Rod Baldwin, 161 Battery's gun position officer, sprinted across the dust to lay out the markers by hand. The guns had to be manhandled into position. Communication lines had not been fully established. Wire barriers were incomplete. Claymore mines had not been deployed. As night fell on the 12th of May, Fire Support Base Coral was a half-built artillery position sitting in exposed ground in enemy territory, and the enemy knew exactly where it was. In the early hours of the 13th of May, the North Vietnamese Army attacked in regimental strength. They came directly at the Australian 102 Field Battery and the mortar platoon of 1 RAR, both of which sat directly in the enemy's axis of advance. What followed was the most desperate close-quarters action fought by Australian gunners since the Second World War. One of 102 Battery's guns, number 6, was overrun. The Australian mortar platoon, facing annihilation, called for Splintex rounds, anti-personnel shells loaded with thousands of small steel darts, to be fired onto their own position. The mortarmen pressed themselves flat into the earth while the steel swept over their heads and cut down the North Vietnamese troops who had made it inside the perimeter. Number 6 gun was retaken. Number 4 gun kept firing high explosive rounds over open sights at point-blank range. Throughout that night, 161 Battery was firing continuously. The Australian gunners ran out of flechette rounds and were forced to improvise, setting standard high-explosive fuses to delay, depressing the guns to fire at the ground 40 to 50 meters in front of each emplacement, causing the shells to ricochet and explode in the air above the assaulting enemy. The 161 Battery gunners supported the same style of close-in fire support throughout the night, firing at whatever range the coordinate center called for, never once losing the rhythm of the gun drill. When dawn came, Coral held. 9 Australians had been killed, 28 were wounded. Over the next 3 weeks, the North Vietnamese would attack Coral and Balmoral repeatedly. 161 Battery moved to Fire Support Base Coogee on the 14th of May to cover a different arc, then returned to Coral when the consolidation of artillery fire was ordered. From Coral, they supported the successful defense of Balmoral when the North Vietnamese launched 2 major regimental-scale assaults on the 26th and 28th of May, both of which were broken up by combined artillery, tank, mortar, and machine gun fire. The New Zealand casualties across 161 Battery's entire 6.5-year deployment came to 5 killed and 22 wounded out of approximately 750 men who rotated through the battery. That figure, measured against the volume of fire the battery had generated and the number of engagements they had supported, was itself a testament to professionalism. In 2019, more than 50 years after the action, the Australian government awarded the Australian Unit Citation for Gallantry to the approximately 120 veterans of 161 Battery who had fought at Coral and Balmoral. It was the first Australian Unit Citation for Gallantry ever awarded to a New Zealand military unit. The question that lingers over all of this is why? Why did 161 Battery generate the kind of fire support that became legendary among the infantry they supported? Part of the answer is cultural. The New Zealand and Australian artillery traditions had come out of the same parent, the Royal Artillery of the British Army, and the two services still ran on nearly identical drill, terminology, and command structure. A New Zealand forward observer could drop straight into an Australian battalion headquarters and work without any translation of vocabulary or procedure. In Vietnam, where American, Vietnamese, Korean, and Thai units were all using different systems, the seamless Anzac artillery partnership was an advantage the Americans never fully reproduced with their own allies. Part of the answer is professional. The intense rate of fire the battery sustained at Long Tan, 8 rounds per gun per minute for hours, was not something the gunners achieved by accident. It was something they had drilled for in exercises where the guns ran hot, the crews ran exhausted, and the drill sergeants pushed them past what the manual said was possible. And part of the answer is that the New Zealanders saw the job as personal. 161 Battery knew it was, by every statistical measure, a marginal contribution. They responded not by trying to be larger than they were, but by being what they were as well as it could possibly be done. The Kiwi guns were fast because they trained fast. They were accurate because they trained accurate. They were unflappable because the tradition they came out of did not permit flapping. When the battery was finally withdrawn in May of 1971, after 6 years, 10 months, and 21 days of continuous deployment, the men came home to a country that had largely turned against the war. Many of the returning veterans faced a reception in Auckland that they described for years afterward with a quiet anger. A parade down Queen Street where the vehicles were pelted with red paint and tomatoes. No welcome from the Returned Services Association, which did not initially recognize Vietnam as a war. The men of 161 Battery, who had fired the rounds that saved Long Tan, who had held the line at Coral and Balmoral, came home to a country that did not particularly want to know what they had done. The recognition came late. The South Vietnam Presidential Unit Citation came in 1977. The Meritorious Unit Commendation from the United States Army came in 1995. The Australian Unit Citation for Gallantry for Coral and Balmoral came in 2019, 51 years after the battles themselves. In each case, the citation was awarded because the evidence had finally been catalogued and found to demonstrate exactly what the infantry had been saying about the Kiwi gunners for decades, that the rounds had always come when they were called for, that the Kiwi guns had never missed. There is a particular way that artillerymen talk about the relationship between forward observers and gun lines. The forward observer cannot see the guns cannot see the target. Between them stretches a thin wire of radio signal, and across that wire pass grid references and corrections. When the system works, it works because the people on both ends of the wire trust each other absolutely. Every round that comes out of the barrel is an act of faith. On the 18th of August 1966, Maury Stanley and the gunners of 161 Battery made 60 acts of faith with each other in the space of 3.5 hours, in weather that made accuracy nearly impossible, against an enemy that outnumbered the men they were protecting by more than 20 to 1. Every one of those acts of faith was repaid. Not one round fell short. Not one round fell on the Australians. That is what the veterans mean when they say, "Send the Kiwi guns." It is a statement about professional trust between small units, forged in 100 routine fire missions before the big one came. When Maury Stanley called, "Stop, stop, stop," Harry Hunter knew his voice, recognized the break in it, and talked him through it. That would have been very hard to replicate through an American Fire Support Coordination Center handling dozens of missions across a Corps-sized operational area. 108 men went into the Long Tan rubber plantation on the afternoon of the 18th of August, 1966. 18 of them died there. 90 came home. The difference between that figure and a total massacre was the wall of steel that fell from the sky between the Australians and the enemy assault waves, sustained without pause for 3.5 hours, coordinated by a New Zealand captain who was more afraid of failing his mates than he was of dying in the mud beside them. That wall of steel was built by 24 guns at Nui Date, 6 of which belonged to 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery. And when the Australian infantry say, as they still say, that the Kiwi guns never missed, what they are telling you is the simple, literal, operational truth of what happened at Long Tan, at Coral, at Balmoral, and at every fire mission in between. The smallest unit in the 1st Australian Task Force. The longest continuous deployment of any combat unit in Vietnam after the 173rd Airborne. 6 guns, about 120 men at any given time, more than 3,000 rounds in 3.5 hours on one afternoon in August 1966 to save a company of infantrymen from another country. Send the Kiwi guns. They never missed.